Bravo, bravo, encore. Oh, sock it to us, Liberace.
That's enough.
Welcome back to Old Hollywood Briar. When I was about 19, I wandered into an antique store in Julian, California, home of the world's greatest pies. I caught sight of a stack of National Geographic magazines. I picked one up and started scanning for the date. 70s, 60s, some of them even went back pre-World War I. I grabbed a tall stack and headed for the cash register. If you ever want to get a real detailed sense of history and humanity, buying old-fashioned hard-copy National Geographic magazines are the way to go. Just slide them in next to the Jugs magazine in your bathroom and you'll learn a whole lot about the world, and fast. One of the first articles I read was about Nixon's visit to Russia. I remember the pictures of smiling Russian faces as far as the eye could see. It was my first view of how we live in a society where media is very political, aka mostly BS. So, from just an American perspective, what went wrong in Russia? What happened? It's always kind of nebulous for us because we never get the real story unless we unearth it. So, as we dig into this 10 Russians blend, which is an obvious nod to another famous Russian blend, I'd like to share how pipe tobacco finally resolved a lot of the questions I had about what happened in Russia at the end of the empire. The root cause analysis is shocking. What happened? Too many people went to college.
Sonar contact, Captain. Fourth quarter. Close aboard. American, Los Angeles class.
American, Captain.
They can't hear us. The singing. Let them sing.
Historian and professor of history at Georgetown University, Carol Quigley, describes part of the root cause of the problem being related to the opening of universities that drew the Russian youth into higher education before the agricultural revolution allowed Russian agriculture to grow enough food to sustain the cities. The tale is told perfectly in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. The youthful student, Rudyard Raskolnikov, filled with the belief that his advanced intelligence gave him the right to commit unspeakable acts against others. It's all there. So I've been really excited to try this blend because it's got Cavendish, Latakia, Oriental, Turkish, and Virginia. I mean, this is a lot of the basic components of the Balkan Sobranie. It's a crumble cake, and you definitely won't need your friend Tonto. So we're gonna slice this up, just see what it looked like if we wanted to try to slice it into a flake. And you'll see it just kind of crumbles apart a little bit too easily to be a flake. But if you're thinking of what I'm thinking, Smoker's Haven crumble cake, right? Or another famous blend you might have heard of called Penzance. Those are all pressed crumble cakes. But Penzance pressed obviously a lot harder because it stays together a lot better. You could just crumble this up. It's dark and rich. I mean, you can see those red Virginias in there, but there's a lot of Latakia. Obviously, this is known as a very famous lat bomb. Very Latakia forward. I read a lot of the reviews on this blend say about how strong it is, but, you know, it sent people running to the bathroom and whatnot. But, you know, Latakia is a smoke-cured Oriental, which is really low on the nicotine. And, you know, one of the things that I noticed is, you know, because a lot of these, like, I'll light a pipe for, you know, theatrical purposes, and, you know, so I'll be smoking the blend, you know, when it's a little too wet still. And I notice a huge difference in this blend between leaving it wet and drying it out. I've seen a lot of people recommend 30-minute drying time for this. Man, I mean, I've wanted to leave this out in the desert of Arizona out with the scorpions for a month. I left it overnight in the tobacco butler and came back and it was still moist to the touch in the morning. So I strongly suggest giving it a good amount of drying time. So going back to the history of Russia, a couple thousand years ago you have the Slavs. They're basically woodsmen. They're evasive, they're trying not to be bothered. Then the Northmen came, people who you would call the Vikings. They conquered them, they married Slav women, and imposed on the rudimentary agricultural hunting economy of the Slavs a superstructure of a tribute-collecting state with an exploitative, militaristic commercial economy. That created a two-class Russian society that has existed ever since. Eventually, the Russian ruling class fell in love with all things Byzantine and brought with them many of the accoutrements of the Byzantine Empire: Orthodox Christianity, the Byzantine alphabet, Byzantine calendar. They even start calling the ruler Tsar or Caesar. Another thing from Byzantium came autocracy and the belief that the state was an absolute power, a totalitarian power, that the state should control thought and religion, and that the church should be a part of the government. Quigley makes a very interesting point here. Remember, he's writing back in 1966, but he says that these concepts of the Russian system must be emphasized because they are so foreign to our own traditions. In the West, the Roman Empire, which continued in the East as the Byzantine Empire, disappeared in 476, and although many efforts were made to revive it, there was clearly a period, about 900, when there was no empire, no state, and no public authority in the West. The state disappeared, yet society continued. So also, religious and economic life continued. This clearly showed that the state and society were not the same thing, that society was the basic entity, and that the state was a crowning but not essential cap to the social structure. This experience had revolutionary effects because it was discovered that man can live without a state. This became the basis of Western liberalism. It was discovered that the state, if it exists, must serve men, and that it is incorrect to believe that the purpose of men is to serve the state. It was discovered that economic life, religious life, law, and private property can all exist and function effectively without a state. From this emerged laissez-faire separation of church and state, rule of law, and the sanctity of private property. In Rome, in Byzantium, and in Russia, the law was regarded as an enactment of supreme power. In the West, where no supreme power existed, it was discovered that law still existed as the body of rules which governed social life. Thus, law was found by observation in the West, not enacted by autocracy as in the East. This meant that authority was established by law and under the law in the West, while authority was established by power and above the law in the East. The West felt that the rules of economic life were found and not enacted, that individuals had rights independent of and even opposed to public authority, that groups could exist as the church existed by right and not by privilege, and without the need to have any charter or incorporation entitling them to exist as a group or act as a group, and that groups or individuals could own property as a right and not a privilege, and that such property could not be taken by force but must be taken by established process of law. It was emphasized in the West that the way things was done was more important than what was done, while in the East, what was done was far more significant than the way in which it was done. All of this kind of takes me back to David Redstone, the creator of the Balkan Sobranie. Remember that Redstone, a Russian Jew, was a Menshevik, which was a group of people opposed to the Tsar, but who wanted political change without having to overturn the apple cart and drag Russia into civil war. Redstone and his family were forced to escape from Russia because the Bolsheviks started just shooting everyone. But how did they get there? Back in the late 1800s, Russia knew that it had to westernize, in technology if not in ideology, throughout all classes of the society in order to survive. This meant very specifically that Russia had to obtain the agricultural revolution and industrialism. But these in turn required that ability to read and write be extended to the peasants, and that the rural population be reduced and the urban population increased. As a result of these reforms, there appeared in Russia for the first time a newly educated class, which was wider than the gentry, being recruited from sons of Orthodox priests or of state officials, including army officers, and, in general, from the fringes of the autocracy and the gentry. When the autocracy became reactionary under Nicholas I, this newly educated group, with some support from the conscience-stricken gentry, formed a revolutionary group generally called the intelligentsia. At first, this new group was pro-Western, but later it became increasingly anti-Western and Slavophile because of its disillusionment with the West. Slavophiles supported orthodoxy and monarchy, although they were very critical of the Orthodox Church and the existing autocracy. Instead of supporting these institutions, many Slavophiles went out into the villages to get in touch with pure Slavic spirituality and virtue, all presented in the shape of the untutored peasant. These missionaries, called narodniki, were greeted with unconcealed suspicion and distaste by the peasants because they were city-bred strangers, educated, and expressed anti-church and anti-governmental ideas. Already disillusioned with the West, the church, and the government, and now rejected by the peasants, the intelligentsia could find no social group on which to base a reform program. The result was the growth of nihilism and of anarchism. I really love this Sassini limited edition leather-bound pipe. Got a beautiful saddle stitching there. The leather's a nice camel color. A lot of these that you see are darkened. I don't think they're darkened by the tobacco, maybe the oils on people's hands or something, but it's pretty rare that you get to find one that's this nice light camel color. I also have one of the darker ones. These are great smokers, by the way, and they stay nice and comfortable. They don't get that hot if you're out in the wind or something because they got leather on them. Let's let this dry here for a while. Let's load this up. At first breath, it's very reminiscent of Hearth and Home's Black House, that classic Americana-style Balkan Sobranie match. That's what you're getting. It's a little rougher around the edges than the Balkan Sobranie. Of course, doesn't have any of the Yanenji, but this is basically the same elemental components of the Balkan Sobranie with probably some more Latakia, which you would really think would remind you more of Penzance, but there's just really something missing there. But definitely is a little bit more like Penzance, and you say that Penzance which is, remember, kind of based off of Smoker's Haven crumble cake, which was pressed Balkan Sobranie. I mean, there's just a web of these nexus little threads that hang out everywhere. But this is a very good blend. It's got a very nice perfume on the leaf. The Lataki is there, it's present, and it just gives you that really nice background smokiness that I really love. And now, is this blend too strong for me? No. Is that because I smoke Burleys and I'm just like Mr. Burley Man? No, that's not why. I think a lot of people that have had the crazy experiences with this blend probably didn't dry it out enough. When I smoked the first pipe, I'm recording the video, so I'm not, letting it dry out as much as I normally would. The first bowl was not good. I didn't like it. It was too sour. It was just very muddled. As soon as I dried it out, I loved it. And that's just another note of how important drying time is, my friends. So I would say, like, this blend, not as strong as Nightcap, because, it doesn't have Perique, so it's not giving you that extra nicotine, that nose tickle. But this is a very good, full English Balkan, more on the Balkan side, but not as much on the Balkan side as like a Penzance or a Durbar. This is more along the, maybe I want to say like a plum pudding or a Nightcap without Perique, something like that. If you like the darker English blends, you will love this blend. It's very, very good. In fact, I would say to those who want to approach the dark, rich English blends but don't like the nose tickle of Perique, here's your guy right here. Very, very tasty blend. After trying to westernize, the Russian autocracy created a class of educated people called the intelligentsia, who tried to return to the villages or communes and were rejected. This ostracization left them in limbo and created inside of them the poison dragon, putting them square on the path to nihilism. Nihilism was a rejection of all conventions in the name of individualism, both of these concepts to be understood in a Russian sense. Since man is a man and not an animal because of his individual development and growth in a society made up of conventions, the nihilist rejection of conventions served to destroy man rather than to liberate him as they expected. The destruction of conventions would not raise man to be an angel, but would lower him to be an animal. Moreover, the individual that the nihilists sought to liberate by this destruction of conventions was not what Western culture understands by the word individual. Rather, it was humanity. The nihilists had no respect whatsoever for the concrete individual or for individual personality. Rather, by destroying all conventions, stripping all persons naked of all conventional distinctions, they hoped to sink everyone, and especially themselves, into the amorphous, indistinguishable mass of humanity. The nihilists were completely atheist, materialist, irrational, doctrinaire, despotic, and violent. They rejected all thought of self so long as humanity suffered. They became atheists because they could not accept a creator who made an evil, incomplete world full of suffering. They rejected all thought, all art, all idealism, all conventions, because these were superficial, unnecessary luxuries, therefore evil. They rejected marriage because it was conventional bondage on the freedom of love. They rejected private property because it was a tool of individual oppression. Some even rejected clothing as a corruption of natural innocence and walked around naked. They rejected vice and licentiousness as unnecessary upper-class luxuries. As Nikolai Berdyaev put it, it is orthodox asceticism turned inside out, and asceticism without grace. At the base of Russian nihilism, when grasped in its purity and depth, lies the orthodox rejection of the world, the acknowledgement of the sinfulness of all riches and luxury, of all creative profusion in art and in thought. Nihilism considers as sinful luxury not only art, metaphysics, and spiritual values, but religion also. Nihilism is a demand for nakedness, for the stripping of oneself of all the trappings of culture, for the annihilation of all historical traditions, for the setting free of the natural man. The intellectual asceticism of nihilism found expression in materialism. Any more subtle philosophy was proclaimed a sin. Not to be a materialist was to be taken as a moral suspect. If you were not a materialist, then you were in favor of the enslavement of man, both intellectually and politically. This philosophy is of great significance because it prepared the ground for Bolshevism. Out of the same spiritual sickness which produced nihilism emerged anarchism. To the anarchist, the chief of all enslaving and needless conventionalities was the state. The discovery that the state was not identical with society, a discovery which the West had made 1,000 years earlier than Russia, could have been a liberating discovery to Russia if, like the West, the Russians had been willing to accept both state and society, each in its proper place. But this was quite impossible in the Russian tradition of fanatical totalitarianism. To this tradition, the totalitarian state had been found evil and must, accordingly, be completely destroyed and replaced by the totalitarian society, in which the individual could be absorbed. Anarchism was the next step after the disillusionment of the Narodniki and the agitations of the nihilists. The revolutionary intelligentsia, unable to find any social group on which to base a reform program, and convinced of the evil of all conventional establishments and of the latent perfection in the Russian masses, adopted a program of pure political direct action of the simplest kind: assassination. Merely by killing the leaders of states, not only in Russia, but throughout the world, governments could be eliminated and the masses freed for social cooperation and agrarian socialism. From this background came the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, of King Humbert of Italy in 1900, President McKinley in 1901, as well as many anarchist outrages in Russia, Spain, and Italy in the period 1890 to 1910. The failure of governments to disappear in the face of this terrorist agitation, especially in Russia, where the oppression of autocracy increased after 1881, led little by little to a fading of the intelligentsia's faith in destructive violence as a constructive action. At that point, even the autocracy lifted the censorship to allow Marxist theory to circulate, in the belief that it would alleviate terrorist pressure, since it eschewed direct political action, especially assassination, and postponed revolution until after industrialization had proceeded far enough to create a fully developed bourgeois class and a fully developed proletariat. To be sure, the theory created by Marx's mid-19th century Germanic background was, and we shall see, gradually changed by the age-long Russian outlook, at first by Leninist Bolshevik triumph over the Mensheviks, and later by Stalin's Russian nationalist victory over Lenin's more Western rationalism. But in the period 1890 to 1914, the stalemate of opposed violence was broken, and progress, punctuated by violence and intolerance, appeared. What went wrong here? Why did the Russian intelligentsia become nihilists and ultimately wage a war against humanity? If you'll remember from our talk on the apocalypse, when Socrates said that the technology of writing would give people not wisdom, but the conceit of wisdom, and that once that happened, they would be a burden to their fellows. Chalk another one up for old Socrates, folks. The intelligentsia came out of school and were met with staggering unemployment and a lack of food. The inability of Russian society to integrate the revolutions in technologies led them to reject key aspects of Western society. And we're talking about 1860 to 1900 here. They sought refuge for their pride in a nationalistic love of the common man. They retreated into the communal farms where they were squarely rejected because they had come back talking about a new world people couldn't understand. Does this remind you of anything? A bunch of people leave the farms, go out to college, become atheists, move into cities and start talking about how God is dead, and they have a bunch of political aspirations that get rejected and find themselves unable to find gainful employment and engage in the society, so they just kind of sit rotting away on, say, things like heroin and stuff, like opioids, until they become disillusioned with the world. Does it remind you of anything? Yeah, no. Okay, me either.
That I can see, it's just my fantasy.